On the Path of the Buddha, a psychologist's guide to the history of Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama was the heir of the Raj of the small republic of Sakka, near the southern border of today's Nepal, in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains of northeastern India, some 2,500 years ago. His father, Suddhodana, was a member of the Kshatriya warrior caste, and therefore undisputed ruler of his kingdom. Legend has it that because of a prophecy that Suddhodana's son would grow up to be a great king only if he did not choose to become a great holy man, Siddhartha's father, his mother had died shortly after giving birth, made the decision that the boy should be raised in great luxury. This way, he would ensure that the young prince would never be tempted to renounce his throne to pursue life as a homeless holy man and ascetic. Thus, Suddhodana decreed that the noble family should live in splendid isolation, and since his kingdom was both economically rich and politically stable, the Raj was able to devote much of his life to giving his son a splendid, and by design, an almost entirely uneventful royal childhood. Siddhartha married at age 16, and his first son was born some 10 years later. The dominant religious practices of the time dated back at least 1,000 years and focused on burnt offering sacrifices made to 33 gods known as devas. Only Brahman priests were considered sufficiently pure to make these sacrifices, and they developed a wide range of esoteric practices to purify themselves before each sacrifice. These practices, based on various aspects of what we know today as yoga, included intensive practice in meditation, fasting, celibacy, social isolation, and physical privation. The ultimate purpose of these religious practices was to achieve liberation from reincarnation after death, which was to be achieved by the accumulation of karma, benefit derived from performing appropriate sacrifices. Many of these Brahmic beliefs and practices would eventually be codified into the religion of Hinduism, but at the time of Siddhartha's life and learning, they represented the practices of the dominant folk religion of the people of the woods, holy men who had withdrawn from society to live solitary ascetic lives devoted to pious ritual and practice. This was, of course, precisely the lifestyle choice that Suddhodana was most desperate to keep from his growing son. As many famous princes have done, and continue to do, the boy Siddhartha grew into a jejune manhood, untroubled by the concerns of ordinary morals. His closest friend and constant companion was Channa, who also served as the young prince's chauffeur, charioteer, and informant about the world beyond the family cloister. The two young men conspired to have adventures, as young men will, but Siddhartha reached the age of marriage and even became a father without once experiencing the joys or sorrows of the real world, just beyond his illusion of his reality. Gradually, however, Siddhartha grew increasingly curious about the life beyond the walls of the royal compound, and he prevailed upon his loyal friend to take him on a clandestine excursion around his kingdom. What he encountered on this trip and its effects on the young man's consciousness were destined to change human history. What Siddhartha saw in the world that his father had tried to hide from him was nothing at all like the world his loving father had so carefully constructed for him in the first 25 years of his life. With his own eyes, he experienced a world filled with human misery and despair. On that day, in rapid succession, the young prince encountered a withered old man bent with infirmity and close to death, another man who was consumed by a disfiguring disease, and then to his ultimate dismay, he saw his first corpse, borne aloft by a large group of tearful mourners. He was struck senseless by the horror of the sorrowful world he saw all around him. Bewildered, he asked the loyal Channa if this is the world in which all men lived. Channa replied, "Yes, master, there is no escape. Old age, sickness, and death, such is the lot of all men." This discovery of the sorrows of life had a profound effect on the young prince, and he was devastated to learn that there were no learned men who could soften or even explain the brutal truths that he had so unexpectedly learned. This new knowledge profoundly changed the young prince, who now withdrew into a period of intense introspection. He could not fathom how ordinary life could be so unrelentingly harsh. Beyond that, he understood all at once that all of the pleasures of his youth had been false, that his happiness had been permitted only by his utter and complete ignorance of the sorrow of the world all around him. In his despair, he entertained the idea that life was utterly futile and that there could be little justification even to bring children into the world. What meaning could anything have in life with the inevitability of disease, infirmity, and ultimately death? At the depths of his anguish, searching everywhere for answers to questions he could barely comprehend, Siddhartha encountered the fourth great image that would shape his character and the religious faith of millions of people in the future. He observed one of the thousands of mystic ascetic men in the forest who populated India during this era. The prince inquired of this strange man, this beggar who struck him as being both wise and untroubled. How could he learn about the meaning of life and get to the heart of the nature of all the suffering he saw all around him? Being an ascetic, the wanderer, of course, told the prince that the only path to finding the answers to his questions required the young man to resign his privileged place and take up life as a wandering seeker, to devote his life to solitude. So, at age 25, Siddhartha left the court, his wife, and his infant son, and took up the life of a religious ascetic. He became the pupil of a series of holy men who instructed him in mental and physical discipline, and spent the next 6 years in self-imposed exile, sustained only by what he could beg from the common people. He nearly died from this regimen of starvation and asceticism, but became a master of what we know today as the practice of Hatha Yoga. In 6 years of rigorous self-denial, he learned how to master his desires and how to quiet and focus the drunken monkey mind of ordinary consciousness. He had considered the desires of his body, and he had tamed his mind. Beyond this, he had gained significant following of disciples, but he was still no closer to answering the great questions in his heart about life, suffering, and death that continued to demand answers. At the end of this period in his life, and near death from starvation, he came to the realization that continuing the severe regimen of privation that he was following would almost certainly bring about his demise before it would lead to his enlightenment. He understood that the answers he was seeking required him to harness not only the energy of his mind, but the resources of his body and his heart as well. So he left the company of the ascetics and accepted food and drink from a young woman named Sujata, who had been caused by a dream to bring him a meal of rice milk in a golden bowl. Nourished by this worldly gift, Siddhartha now embarked on a continuous meditation under an ancient fig tree known in Buddhist legend as the Bodhi tree, or the tree of wisdom. He vowed to remain under the tree until he had attained the great enlightenment. On the 49th day of his meditation, under the full moon of May in 544 BCE, Siddhartha attained the supreme enlightenment and became the Buddha, the enlightened one. No one, it is said, can possibly explain enlightenment. It does not lend itself to description or explanation in words. The man who has awakened, however, is in no doubt about the occurrence. Although unable to describe it, he knows what has happened to him, just as someone in love may not be able to describe his feelings, yet is himself in no doubt about his particular physical and emotional state, or as a dying man of thirst will know when his thirst is quenched. As a term, enlightenment signifies a direct, dynamic, spiritual experience brought about in the Buddhist view through the faculty of intuition, a faculty developed and sharpened by such spiritual disciplines as intense meditation and contemplation. It is a condition beyond the power and pull of the opposites, a full realization of the universe and the self as one. After he attained enlightenment, Siddhartha was called Shakyamuni, which means sage of the Shakyas, the clan his father ruled. The Buddha would spend the rest of his life spreading the word of his enlightenment to his disciples throughout India. These disciples, in turn, carried the message southward into Southeast Asia countries of Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and eastward into China, Tibet, Korea, and Japan. The message that the Buddha's disciples carried was one of supreme compassion. Their mission was to offer humankind the opportunity to make the same discoveries about the nature of life and of suffering, and that the Buddha himself had made. There were, of course, certain central propositions that the Buddha's disciples taught, but the central message of Buddhism always was, and to this day continues to be, an experiential one. A perfected Buddhist might be described as a human being who has reached a state in which moral training has become so deeply a part of his nature that it would be impossible for him to be involved in violence, cupidity, insensibility, low physical passion, or unawareness. One of the principal things that stands out about this legend is that the central teachings that inform Buddhism were not revealed to the Buddha in a divine message received from on high. They came to a mortal man who had spent 6 long years of his life in relentless search of a philosophy that would inform his existence and make the world around him sensible to him. To this day, Buddhist teaching is much less about doctrine than it is about a dedication to a set of mental practices, a firm mental discipline through which truth is revealed by the fullest awakening of the human mind. Buddhism holds out the prospect of peace, fulfillment, and ultimately release from suffering, not through any sort of divine intercession, but through the exercise and control of one's own mind and senses. The release that is spoken of in Buddhism is not into a supernatural realm, but into a human zone where greed, hate, and delusion are turned aside. Simply, by the disciple act of systematically letting go of attachment and desire, reduced to its core, Buddhism is about developing a form of universal wisdom rooted in compassion for all living things. The great power of Buddhism, for many psychologists, is that it is so completely and powerfully true. Day after day, we encounter clients who work single-mindedly and furiously against their own best interests. They seek to impose their will upon the world in order to secure love, respect, or devotion. Yet the harder they rail against the reality, the more isolated, alienated, and alone they become. We want to say to them, be still. Give your kids a chance to come to you. Risk not controlling every human interaction. Trust that your heart can lead you where you want to go. Calm your monkey mind. Listen to the wisdom of your body. See that there are no closed doors. Feel the release that comes with every breath. The wisdom of the Buddha's revelation is that the answers to life's most perplexing and persistent dilemmas are not outside ourselves. The therapist cannot cure. God is unlikely to rescue you. Love is a gift that is offered. It can no more be seized, contained, controlled, or consumed than air. There's no meaningful distinction between you and me. Age, gender, skin color, infirmity, flags of nations, none of these constructs are for you a different world than the one I inhabit. Our tears are the same. Our children are the same. Our fears, our hope, and our minds are the same. Every atom that divides us is an illusion. Every perception, attitude, sensory impression is arbitrary. Every distinction, every category, every drawn line in the sand is meaningless. There is no fixed trait that is the center of a human being any more than there is a fixed point that is the center of the universe. Life is a never static. All life is process. It is not in any way, shape, or form a fixed entity. Life is an ever-moving stream of atoms, molecules, energy fields, beings, becomings, and yes, even extinctions. The one great idea that defines Buddhism, and that informs every chapter in this book, is that the universe is a system of interrelated parts, a seamless, beginningless, endless flow of energy and appearances. You try to explain to your client that she can't coerce her spouse into loving her. You try to help him see that whatever power he achieves will only deepen the insecurities that haunt him. Joy is not in the substance, be it gold or crack cocaine. You try through your work with families, schools, communities, and the legislative bodies to increase motivation, to end violence in human society, to end the greedy destruction of our trees, rivers, and oceans, and to cultivate moral responsiveness to other beings and to life of earth itself. Yet the false gods all require us to suspend our rational powers, to discredit what we have known intuitively since infancy, that the possibility of human happiness can only be realized by embracing our humanity and recognizing that it exists only in connection with others and the rest of creation. The great and most powerful human faculty is empathy. The most profound and transformative human motive is compassion. The central problem addressed by Buddhism is, how can we overcome the universal illusion of our unique, separate, bounded individuality? How do we get beyond the false notion that I am I and you are other? How do we strike through the masks, the pretensions, and the cowardice of the illusion of our own immortality? For the central irony of our existence is that our lifelong quest for union, for oneness with the universe, for transcendence in reality, ultimately requires us to develop an extraordinary sense of our own being and non-being. The key to solving this problem lies in the development of our consciousness. For if we do not preserve and deepen our natural consciousness, how can we ever see the truth? True, I am just a subatomic speck in the universe, but I am a subatomic speck with mind. I possess potential awareness, not only of my own speckness, but also of the thousands and even millions of other specks all around me. The faculty of comprehension that I need to understand this awareness is the defining characteristic of I, but not a separated and independent I. This comprehension is what Buddhism refers to as the compassionate oneness of the self. Roger Walsh, a psychiatrist who has spent many years focusing on the ways in which Buddhist practice and modern psychology inform each other about the nature of reality, has developed a special interest in how Buddhism casts a light on the experience of the self. Walsh, 1998, has written, "The extent to which consciousness is normally occupied by fantasy is enormous. That this gross encroachment on awareness has gone largely unnoticed, for example, by behavioral scientists, represents a significant hiatus in Western psychology. Meditation tends to reduce the amount of this fantasy, and initial fantasy-free episodes may elicit feelings of strangeness, unreality, and discomfort reduction in the amount of fantasy, therefore may reduce the sense of separation from others. It may be impossible to think or work one's way out of these fantasies, and in fact such attempts may exasperate them. However, withdrawing attention from them and continually fixing the mind on a neutral object may collapse them." The basic teachings of the Buddha. After attaining enlightenment, the Buddha spent the rest of his years teaching the truths that he had realized. He was never doctrinaire in his teachings and always instructed his followers to work with diligence. "Be lamps unto yourselves, but take yourselves no external refuge. Look not for refuge to anyone besides yourself. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp." Indeed, he taught the ideal that his followers should just sit and engage their practice, so that others might join them in their own practice. No salesmanship, no proselytizing. In the Buddhism of the Buddha, there is no dogma, no hierarchy, and no idea of an elect group of keepers of a received truth. The Buddha died after eating a meal of poisonous mushrooms in the forest. He instructed his followers to burn his body and asked that his relics be placed in a stupta, or burial mound, at a place where 4 roads meet. He then said, "And whoever shall put flowers or scents on it, or whitewash, or shall express devotion, or feel confidence in his heart here, that will be long for his welfare and happiness." Harvey, 1990. And that was the end. The core teachings of the Buddha. So the ultimate truth of the Buddha is that the answers to life's most pressing and vexing questions lie entirely within us. These truths, however, will not become clear to us so long as we lead lives that are disruptive and full of the contamination of the 3 consuming fires, of greed, hate, and delusion. We must therefore adopt habitual practices to center our attention and cultivate our consciousness. We must come to understand our lives, ourselves, as ever-changing and infinite, yet universal and part of the totality of the universe. At the heart of the teaching lies the idea that everything matters, everything is connected, and that we are vulnerable to suffering because suffering is part of being a living thing. Dukkha, or suffering, is the principal focus of the core of the Buddhist teaching. Indeed, almost everyone who has any passing acquaintance with Buddhism knows that among the 4 noble truths identified by the Buddha, the first and most profound is that all life is suffering. Buddhists know, however, that this dukkha, this suffering, is a sort of universal sickness, not unlike in its nature the Christian concept of original sin. To be human, to have awareness, and to participate fully in life, one must encounter the inescapable facts of sickness, death, and decay. Because we are human, we are vulnerable to sorrow, pain, grief, and despair, to separation from what we love, what we want, and what we need. Life is never precisely as we would have it, and thus, life is always to some degree unsatisfactory. The problem is that we become attached to our desires, and when they cannot be fully met, we feel discouraged, abandoned, and resentful. Every happiness eventually passes into regret for its unsustainability, and we become greedy, fearful that we haven't had our fair share, that life has cheated us. This doctrine is not just a rephrasing of the wisdom of the ascetic forest dwellers. However, the Buddha had experienced the extremes of deprivation and knew that extreme hardship was not the route to enlightenment or self-discovery. It is not the experience of pleasure that Buddhism seeks at the heart of the human dilemma. It is attachment, dependency on things that bring those pleasures that must be overcome. Giving up attachments does not mean giving up enjoyments of life's pleasures. It means, rather, never being dependent on the pleasures. It means being ready to forego the pleasures without frustration. If a splendid meal is available, enjoy it. If not, be content with a humble meal. You've gotten tickets to this special concert. Wonderful. If not, find some other useful way to spend the evening. If you have nice clothes, enjoy them. If you have shabby clothes, ignore them. The second noble truth, therefore, explains that the suffering that is so central and so much a part of our lives is something that we create out of our ignorant greed and grasping. Our suffering is rooted in our desires, and our desires are rooted in our selfish self-centeredness. We are too attached to a world that, in reality, is completely transitory. But we both console and fool ourselves into believing that if we can just possess just one more person or thing, that we can escape the sorrows associated with being alive. We crave pleasures that are never just exactly what we crave them to be, because the world is constantly changing, and it is never perfectly as we desire it to be. We seek pleasures and even beliefs to enhance our own being, but we are blindly and perhaps deliberately ignorant of the cost of those pleasures and beliefs to other beings. At the heart of the Buddha's teaching about these desires were his teachings about the nature of the self. Especially in the West, we tend to see ourselves as detached, independent, autonomous actors. This is the basic attitude of I am, deep-rooted self-assertion or egoism, which is concerned about how I measure up to others. Harvey, 1990. Page 54. Buddhism replaces this egoism with the unifying concept of conditioned arising or dependent origination. Almost every chapter that follows in this volume is directly or indirectly concerned with this concept. The Buddha himself and his closest disciples considered this specific doctrine to be so clearly at the heart of the teaching that it was said that until the truth of conditioned arising is comprehended, there is no possibility for enlightenment. The essence of this doctrine is the idea that every aspect of creation originates from every other aspect of creation. No part stands alone or outside the whole. This principle, called the principle of conditionality, states that all things, mental and physical, arise and exist due to the presence of certain conditions, and cease once their conditions are removed. Nothing is independent. The most obvious, but in some ways most obscure lesson to be learned is the absolute interdependence of everything in creation. This is the teaching of Buddhism that demonstrates that concern for the environment, for other species, and for all other organisms isn't just anthropomorphic sentimentality, but is actually a profound spiritual concern. This doctrine of conditioned arising is the source of the deep ecology that many Buddhists practice in their politics and in their daily lives. Buddhism directly applies these principles to the whole concept of suffering, dukkha, and this is where many psychologists find the most relevance of the teaching to their personal and professional lives. The conditions that give rise to suffering, which can be thought as continuating spiritual ignorance, can be changed through education. Thus, suffering can be eliminated by the destruction of the ignorance that gives rise to it. Ignorance is abolished through the development of conscious, compassionate awareness. Thus is derived the third noble truth, that suffering is not permanent or eternal, that the roots of suffering, egoism, greed, selfishness, and the like, can be known, understood, and rooted out. When craving comes to an end, it brings about the end of dukkha. This is the teaching that comes closest to the Buddha addressing the process of reunification. But what is critical in this doctrine is that it is not the prospect of happiness, harmony, or enlightenment that is renounced. Buddhism is most definitely not an iteration of nihilism or any sort of radical relativism. The renunciation one focuses on in Buddhism is the renunciation of craving. The usual Buddhist metaphor is the quenching of fire. This, the Buddha's fire sermon, teaches that everything internal and external to a person is burning with the fires of attachment, hatred, and delusion, and of birth, aging, and death. Here the fires refer both to the causes of dukkha and to dukkha itself. Attachment and hatred are closely related to craving for things and craving to be rid of things, and delusion is synonymous with spiritual ignorance. Nirvana, during life is frequently defined as the destruction of these three fires, or defilements. When one has destroyed these dies, he cannot be reborn, and so is totally becoming the remaining fires of birth, aging, and death, having attained final nibbana. Harvey, 1990. The ability to vanquish desire is developed according to the Four Noble Truths, by living one's life in accord with a set of 8 highly refined principles, widely known in Western world as the Noble Eightfold Path. These are the so-called 8 rights: right understanding, purpose, speech, conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Nancy Wilson Ross presented these as they were reconceptualized rather gracefully by the Anglo-Irish historian and philosopher Gerald Heard, 1971. Number 1. First, you must see clearly what is wrong. Number 2. Next, you must decide that you want to be cured. 3. You must act. 4. Speak so as to aim at being cured. 5. Your livelihood must not conflict with your therapy. 6. Therapy must go forward at the staying speed that is critical velocity that can be sustained. 7. You must think about it incessantly. And 8. Learn how to contemplate with the deep mind. These were the basic precepts of the way of life which the Buddha undertook to preach in 45 years of active ministry after he had made the initial great decision to beat the drum of Dharma, truth, in the darkness of the world. Ross, 1981. Thus, the Buddha's message is that we can control and even extinguish our suffering, and if we dedicate ourselves to a drastic change in our consciousness through a deliberate recharting of the way we think, perceive, and relate to others, karmic tendencies, this is more than just following Alfred Adler's admonition to ask each day what you can do today to make life better for someone else, though that is surely a good start. It is a change in our moral reasoning, a transformation in the way we live, carried out in order to increase our understanding of our own nature and our place in creation. The problem, of course, is that as the famous Buddhist prayer recognizes, though the number of my passions is infinite, I vow to conquer them all. The struggle to live life on the correct path, to take change of one's passions, and to recognize the futility of trying to escape from taking responsibility for one's thoughts, motives, and deeds is indeed difficult, but has one powerful ally deep within one's consciousness. For the Buddhist prayer quoted above has a second verse. It goes something like this: though the number of thinking beings is infinite, I vow to help them all. This is how the actions of ordinary men and women create and maintain karma, the Buddhist term for deeply ingrained patterns of thoughts, words, and deeds that constitute our style of relating in the world. Compassion is the priceless jewel in the center of the granite carving of the Buddha at his most serene. As Ross, 1981, has noted, Buddhism goes beyond the doctrine that you should be your brother's keeper, or that you should treat everyone as your brother. It states that you are your brother. Compassion is a sort of compass that keeps one clear about the course of the Noble Eightfold Path. Compassion subverts my devotion to preserving a separate and isolated I. It is the heartfelt aspiration that all living beings will know relief from the harshness of the world. Compassion connects me to all living things. In an ancient Buddhist chant, followers are told to conquer anger by loving kindness, conquer evil by good, conquer the stingy by giving, conquer the liar by truth. May all beings be happy and secure. May they be happy-minded, whatever living beings there are, feeble or strong, stout or medium, short, small or large, seen or unseen, those dwelling far or near, those who are born or those who await rebirth. May all beings, without exception, be happy-minded. Let none deceive another, nor despise any person, whatever in any place. In anger or ill will, let them not wish any suffering to each other. Just as a mother would protect her only child at the risk of her own life, even so, let him cultivate a boundless heart towards all beings. Let his thoughts of boundless loving kindness pervade the whole world, above, below, across, without obstruction, without any hatred, without any animosity. Whether he stands, walks, sits, or lies down, as long as he is awake, he should develop his mindfulness. This, they say, is divine abiding here. Not falling into wrong views, virtuous and endowed with insight, he gives up attachment for sense desires. He will surely not come again to any womb. Buddhist practice. The practice of Buddhism can be seen to have three basic components. These include the development of a moral lifestyle informed by a strong ethical code, membership in a community, or sangha, where one fulfills one's responsibilities to society, and developing mindfulness or meditation, chanting, or enlightenment. As should be clear, the cornerstone of Buddhist ethics is the eradication of sorrow and suffering from the world. Thus, one's thoughts, speech, and behavior should all be attuned to creating the greatest amount of happiness for oneself and others. This is not an ethics that described by rituals and duties. It is a natural ethics that evolves out of one's awareness of the suffering of others. I get the impression that when people are not much interested in religion, they also neglect values like compassion, a sense of sharing, a sense of caring, all the things that people consider to be a religious message reject. That's a mistake. These are secular ethics, not a religious message, and they are for everyone. Everyone can understand that being human, you want a happy life, a happy family, and to be a happy individual, but material things will not provide you with genuine inner peace or inner happiness. Human values are essential. We must find a way to present basic human values to everyone and present them not as religious matters, but as secular ethics that are essential whether you are religious or not. Dalai Lama, 2001. As we have seen, the doctrine of conditioned arising clearly defines the self as existing only in relation to all other beings. If I behave in a way that causes another pain, it cannot have any effect except to increase my own pain and alienation as well. As one sutra says, since the self of others is dear to each one, let him who loves himself not harm another. When I help you, I am in fact helping myself, and by helping myself, I further my potential to help others. Beyond this general principle, there are 5 ethical precepts that constitute the core of Buddhist ethical teaching. The first precept here is to avoid taking or injuring another life. The second is to forswear any act of theft or thievery, fraud, or cheating. The third is to refrain from any inappropriate sexual acts, although Buddhism does not provide any universal definitions of what is or is not appropriate sexual interaction. The fourth precept prohibits any form of lying or intentional deception. Lying is bad when it manipulates others for one's gain, of course, but it is also a bad practice because it removes one from the course of finding the truth. In other words, lying increases delusion and self-deception. The fifth precept warns against the use of intoxicants or engaging in any practice that clouds the judgment or disturbs mental clarity. At the heart of all Buddhist ethical systems is a clear concern for compassion and deep loving kindness towards all beings, and this generalizes into one's actions towards and responsibilities to the other members of one's community, the Sangha. In the ancient texts, the stings about the Sangha were intended to set out the rules by which monks and nuns should live and practice with each other in closed religious communities. In modern usage, the Sangha infers more broadly to all of the members of one's religious community. Beyond that, in this book, the editors and several of the authors would like to extend the notion of the Sangha to include all of the members of one's professional and residential community, and ultimately to extend that concept to all of the people of the world. Thus, Buddhists around the world are increasingly concerned with issues such as social justice, human rights, the protection of the environment, the rights of women, the development of strong community structures, the plight of refugees, and world peace. An exemplar of this tradition, the current Dalai Lama, His Holiness Tenzin Gyatso, whose writings are widely distributed around the world, is widely regarded as one of the leaders of the modern era who is clearly identified with the promotion of world peace and the resolution of global conflicts. Other major Buddhist figures promoting world peace are Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist priest whose writings for peace are also known worldwide and who has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and Daisaku Ikeda, the president of the Soka Gakkai International, whose peace proposals have been made to the United Nations since 1978 and whose mission for Kausen Rofu, or world peace, is practiced by his 12 million followers in 177 countries and territories around the world. The third domain of practice refers to the activities undertaken by individuals, whether or not they call themselves Buddhists, to engage in certain practices with the aim of developing wisdom or prajna. The collective name we give all of these practices is meditation. But, as we will see, the scope of various meditative practices ranges far beyond the common notion of sitting silently in the lotus position while repeating a mantra in one's mind, to include chanting mantra, reciting the Buddhist teaching, mandala meditation, and many other highly disciplined practices. The sort of meditation one learns to practice depends as much upon geography as anything else. As Buddhism spread across Asia in the centuries after the Buddha's death, it took on the distinctive characteristics of the cultures where it took root. These regional and cultural variations differ more in form than in substance, although important differences in teachings do exist. And we can expect that as Buddhism gains increasing numbers of adherents in the Western world, the practices employed by Western Buddhists will take on a flavor and character of their own. Theravada, or Hinayana Buddhism. This is the oldest of the Buddhist branches. The Theravada branch, it has been defined as the Way of the Elders, a term for the Buddhist community in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, based on the Buddhist scriptures preserved in the Pali language. It traces its roots to the time of the Indian Emperor Asoka, who was responsible for the spread of Buddhism into Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. According to the legend of Asoka, converted to Buddhism after encountering a Buddhist monk who refused to be physically or emotionally disturbed by the process of being boiled in a cauldron of water in the emperor's torture chamber. The emperor witnessed the monk chanting affably with the men who were stoking the fire under the cauldron, and was so impressed that he converted to Buddhism on the spot. The monk went on to become the king's religious teacher, and Asoka's daughter, Sanghamita, went on to bring Theravada Buddhism to the people of Sri Lanka. The Theravada Buddhists eventually created a vast, powerful, and enlightened empire throughout Southeast Asia. Over the ensuing centuries, the vast temple complexes in Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka are testimony to the extraordinary technical and aesthetic heights achieved by these communities.